Tonight, ISIS's wrath only continues to grow as global leaders agree on the need to take immediate action. However, what action will be taken on the policy front? Well, the U.S. has been talking a good game, but the question is, when it comes down to policy, is America falling short? And Governor Cuomo's challengers, Zephyr Teachout and Rob Astorino, face off in a debate, disagreeing on just about every key issue, except when it comes to the governor and where he's been on both debates here and the Moreland Commission. We'll talk about that in New York politics coming up as well. Plus, no election season is complete without them. Now, we're taking a look here at some of the best and worst campaign ads we've seen so far. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. And tonight, we begin with a look across the globe, where world crises stretching from the Ukraine to the Middle East, including Syria and Iraq and beyond, have world leaders on edge. Now, this morning, Ukraine's president announced a ceasefire had been reached between government forces and the pro-Russia rebels. Now, if the deal holds, and that's a big if, it would end nearly 5 months of fighting in eastern Ukraine. But the question is, what happens next? President Obama says he's skeptical the Russian separatists will follow through on their end of the bargain. And despite all the chaos erupting across the globe, President Obama seems most focused on ISIS. Today, speaking from Wales at a NATO conference, the president said the U.S. and its NATO allies have the means to dismantle the militant group. The president said ISIS is a savage organization that must, forget about being contained, must be destroyed.
There was unanimity over the last 2 days that ISIL poses a significant threat to NATO members. And there was a recognition that we have to take action. We are going to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIL the same way that we have gone after al-Qaeda. We will not be placing U.S. ground troops to try to control the areas that are part of the conflict inside of Syria.
And while the president and vice president have openly detested ISIS and said the group will pay for the beheadings of 2 American journalists and the havoc it has wreaked across the region, the U.S. seems to be lacking a strong policy play to deal with the crisis. And this has Republicans and even some Democrats sounding off.
I think he's wrong.
His foreign policy is an absolute free fall.
I've learned one thing about this president, and that is he's very cautious. Maybe in this instance, too cautious.
The American public doesn't have an itchy trigger finger right now when it comes to military intervention, especially the kind and scope of which is being contemplated to take on ISIS.
Now, earlier today, I spoke with Politico defense reporter Jeremy Herb about what the U.S. could, let alone should, do to ease the conflict. The president's speech today, I'm curious, what was the reaction both from the Hill and also DOD?
Well, you know, I think he talked more about the way that the U.S. is going to ultimately try to degrade, dismantle ISIS, but it's not really going to satisfy his critics. The president has taken a lot of heat for saying that they don't have a strategy yet in Syria. Today he announced that they would be having, a 10-country coalition working against ISIS. But at the same time, they're still not clear what that means in terms of how they would go after them in Syria. And things like that, I think, are what critics on the Hill, Republicans in particular, want to hear from the president.
Well, do some nuts and bolts for us and start on the Hill, Jeremy, in that he's talked about and has asked for a while now for both funds and resources, A, in Eastern Europe, and then B, also in terms of committing to the NATO efforts here to not just contain but destroy ISIS. Is the money going to be there? Is Congress going to appropriate?
Well, it's going to be a real interesting thing to see. So Congress is coming back for about 2 weeks now in September, and they're probably just going to pass a bill to keep the government funded and not really get into new funding. But I think this new crisis with ISIS really is going to change the calculus in terms of whether the Congress is going to approve some of these funds. The president asked for a $1 billion fund for Europe and $5 billion for a new counterterrorism fund, which part of that would go towards funding the Syrian rebels who are moderates, giving them $500 million. So now that we have this issue with ISIS, I think it's more likely that we are going to see that money come forward.
In terms of what the president said, and that, again, the distinction between containing and destroyed. He made it clear. He said, you can't contain these guys, you got to destroy it. This coming on the heels of what the vice president had to say yesterday. You have contacts within the Defense Department. Do they have clarity? They heard the president, but are they clear on what he means and how far he's willing to go to accomplish that aim?
Well, I think that's a good question. Pentagon officials are very careful to say they're presenting options for the president, that they're not weighing in on what should be done, that they're just giving him all the options that he needs. Obviously, it is a bit of a change to hear the president say that they can't be contained, as he was talking earlier this week about ISIS being a manageable problem. We have to turn them into a manageable problem, and that drew a lot of criticism, including from some Democrats who came out and said, you can't manage ISIS, you have to go destroy them. So we're hearing stepped up rhetoric from the president, but we haven't seen yet is whether that's going to translate into additional military action, particularly in Syria. The Defense Department General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he's been clear that without going into Syria and going after them, we're not going to be able to destroy ISIS. And so now we have to see, is President Obama willing to take that step?
It is in a prism, Jeremy, an election year, and we've heard some Democrats, as you said, Senator Feinstein. We heard from Jane Harman, who used to be a Democratic power, especially in this segment on the Hill, coming strongly against the president. More than the words here, what do you think happens? Do we have a coherent strategy, something that he can articulate and say, this is where our line is, this is how far we're willing to go or not go? Does he have to define it that clearly, or does this get, in effect, punted to Congress as long as he says, we'll get the money and I'll give it to the folks and let them spend it as they will? What kind of clarity do we get between now and November?
So far, the clearest thing we've heard is that there aren't going to be boots on the ground. The president reiterated that today. In Iraq and in Syria, we're not going to put U.S. combat troops back. Otherwise, the situation, I think, is a bit more muddy. There have been Democrats who are up for re-election in 2014 coming out and criticizing the president. Senator Franken, Senator Shaheen have said that he hasn't laid out a clear enough strategy. At the same time, I think there's a lot of reluctance to actually take a vote on authorizing military action. So now as Congress comes back, we're going to be seeing, are they going to vote for military authorization, for money, and what does that look like? There have been a couple of bills that have been put out so far, but there hasn't been an indication from congressional leadership that they're actually going to hold a vote before November.
And you've seen the report from the BBC, Jeremy, that in effect we'll be working either tacitly or even directly with the Iranians here. I guess we have a common interest when it comes to ISIS. Do you think the White House is prepared to fully articulate or even acknowledge that we're going to be working with folks that were not too long ago part of the axis of evil here against the common enemy?
It's a complicated and difficult problem for them, and not just working with the Iranians, but we also have a common enemy with the Syrian president, Bashar Assad. His regime is fighting against ISIS, and it's, the U.S. obviously does not want to be aligned with Assad, who Obama has said for a long time needs to be driven out of power. It's also complicated with the Iranians. We do, have more of a relationship now. We're in nuclear negotiations with them, but it's still a country that we don't necessarily want to be allied with, and the other way around is true too. Iran's leadership certainly does not want to be seen as working with the U.S., and so it's a problem on their end. I think that is something we're not going to see publicly, the two sides saying, yes, we're working together, but on the ground, especially if airstrikes ramp up in places like Syria, there could be some implicit kind of work, maybe not working together, but certainly acknowledging what the other one is doing.
Bizarre bedfellows, I guess. But Jeremy, I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.